The hearing room hummed with tension long before she spoke. Cameras blinked like watchful eyes, pens hovered midair, and whispers rippled through the crowd like static. Jasmine Crockett sat still, the faintest calm on her face, as if she'd already seen the ending to this play. On the other side, Tom Homan straightened his tie and smirked, the practiced smirk of a man too sure of his own power. The chair recognized her. A hush fell, heavy and sudden. Crockett leaned toward the microphone, her voice measured, deliberate, unflinching. "The conspiracy," she began, letting each word fall like a gavel, "is complete." The phrase hung in the air, sharp enough to cut. A reporter dropped his pen. One aide looked up in disbelief. The room for a moment seemed to stop breathing. Even Homan's smirk faltered, just slightly, just enough to show that he heard the tremor beneath her calm. Across social media, clips of that single sentence were already being clipped, shared, and captioned before she finished. What conspiracy? The question spread faster than the echo of her voice. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence do the work. "When public office becomes a business," she said softly, "when influence is auctioned off in the shadows, that's not governance. That's collusion dressed up in patriotism." Homan shifted, the leather chair creaking under him. His fingers tapped the desk. A rhythm of unease disguised his confidence. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. "We have names, transactions, and signatures. And if the American people could see what I've seen, they'd know this isn't about policy. It's about profit." Murmurs swelled again, but no one dared interrupt. Somewhere behind the cameras, an aide mouthed to another, "She just said it." Crockett paused, a faint, knowing smile crossing her face. "So before this hearing proceeds," she said, "let's all remember, truth doesn't need permission to speak." The gavel struck once. The room exhaled. Outside, the headlines were already writing themselves, but inside, one question lingered like the weight of a storm cloud. If the conspiracy was complete, how deep did it go? And who else was hiding behind the curtain? And that was the moment America began to listen. 48 hours earlier, the story was just the whisper, a half-buried leak on a quiet Friday afternoon. A few journalists noticed, a handful of watchdogs tweeted, and then the silence settled in. The documents had come from an anonymous source, encrypted, time-stamped, and heavy with implication. They traced a series of payments, consulting fees, travel reimbursements, security advisories, all leading to one familiar name, Tom Homan. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The man who had spent years thundering about law and order, now linked to secret money flowing through a shell company in Virginia? It sounded too cinematic to be true. But Jasmine Crockett had seen enough politics to know that reality is often written like a screenplay. Except in Washington, the villains rarely admit they're in the script. She studied every page that night, the lines highlighted in yellow under the glow of a desk lamp. The transactions formed a pattern, and the pattern told a story. Influence for sale. Promises exchanged for favors. Border security contracts awarded with a wink. It was all there, buried in fine print and arrogance. By morning, she called a staff meeting. "We can't sit this one out," she said. "If this holds up, it's not just a scandal. It's a blueprint for corruption." Her aides hesitated. They'd seen what happens when someone challenges the machine. "They'll come for you," one warned. "They'll twist it. They'll make it personal." Crockett looked up from the folder. then they'll have to face the truth while they do it. Meanwhile, the internet was already stirring. Independent creators dissected screenshots, analysts traced campaign contributions, and within hours, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Homan Money Trail and hashtag Receipts Not Rhetoric. The public wanted answers, but mainstream media stayed quiet, too cautious, too complicit, or too comfortable. Crockett understood the silence. Washington protects its own. But the leak changed everything. Someone had left a trail of digital fingerprints that led straight to the heart of power, and she was determined to follow it. Behind closed doors, her allies advised patience. Wait until the committee's next session, they said. Build the case quietly. But Crockett had learned that delay is just another form of denial. The people who sent her to Congress didn't vote for quiet. They voted for courage. She spent the next 2 days cross-checking every figure, every name, every timestamp. By the third night, her eyes burned, but her conviction hardened. It wasn't just about Tom Homan anymore. It was about what his story revealed, how corruption hides behind patriotic slogans, how power shields itself with noise. And as she closed the last file, a quiet certainty settled over her. If we don't expose this, she whispered to herself, they'll write the history without us. The next morning, she walked into the Capitol not as a lawmaker defending a seat, but as a woman carrying proof. She knew the storm she was walking into, the smears, the threats, the coordinated outrage. But she also knew something they didn't. Truth, once spoken clearly, can't be unsaid. Her aides exchanged uneasy glances as cameras gathered outside. You sure about this? One asked. Crockett's reply was steady. I'm sure they'll wish I wasn't. The elevator doors closed. The countdown had begun. And when they opened again, she would no longer be the question. She would be the answer they couldn't bury. Because in Washington, silence is strategy. But what happens when someone refuses to play by its rules? Before Tom Homan became a name whispered in scandal, he was the face of a certain kind of America, the kind that measured patriotism by punishment and order by fear. His career was built on sharp suits, stern warnings, and the constant performance of authority. He called himself a man of the law, but over the years, that law had begun to look suspiciously like loyalty, not to justice, but to whoever signed the checks. Cameras loved him. Networks booked him. He was the embodiment of the no-nonsense enforcer, a man who could turn compassion into weakness with a smirk. If you don't like our laws, he once sparked on live TV, change them. The audience clapped. The ratings spiked. Homan had learned early that outrage was a currency, and he spent it like he'd never run out. Behind closed doors, though, he was already building another empire, one that didn't operate in daylight. After retiring from ICE, he became a consultant, a commentator, a policy advisor. Vague titles that looked clean enough on paper, but blurred the line between public service and private profit. Every few months, a new company appeared with a patriotic name and a hidden purpose. Border security tech, private detention contracts, research on immigration control. And somewhere in the quiet bookkeeping of these ventures, the first signs of the conspiracy began to take shape. Those who worked with him described him as charming but controlling. He was the man who remembered your birthday, but also remembered your weakness. The kind of person who could turn a favor into a leash. He cultivated influence, attending fundraisers, shaking hands with lawmakers, offering expert advice to anyone who could further his reach. And then came the consulting firm, Patriot Strategies, LLC. Its stated purpose, to advise on border enforcement logistics. Its actual function, to funnel payments between government contractors and political insiders, all while maintaining the veneer of legitimacy. The invoices were polished, the transactions buried under layers of bureaucracy. It was corruption wrapped in the American flag. Crockett's investigation revealed what Homan's supporters refused to see. The hero of law and order had become the salesman of the system he once swore to uphold. His signature appeared on memos approving advisory disbursements. His name turned up in correspondence with firms that mysteriously won federal bids. And yet each time questions arose, he dismissed them with the same line: fake news from people who hate America. For years, that deflection worked. He was too connected, too insulated by the political machine that had built him. But every fortress has cracks, and Homan's appeared when the money trail reached people who didn't know they were part of his performance. Contractors began whispering. Staffers started leaking. A few brave insiders turned over emails. What had once been whispers became receipts. Still, he carried himself like a man untouchable. He strutted into hearings with rehearsed indignation, weaponizing patriotism to silence scrutiny. "You think I did this for money?" he'd scoff. "I've served this country my whole life." But service and self-interest aren't the same. And by the time Jasmine Crockett's office cross-verified the documents, the facade was cracking. The man behind the badge wasn't just a lawman, he was a brand that sold fear to the public and influence to the powerful. And like all brands built on illusion, exposure was its undoing. In the days leading up to the hearing, he'd reportedly laughed off the rumors. "She won't have the guts," he told an aide. "It'll blow over like everything else." But he didn't understand who he was dealing with. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a pundit chasing headlines. She was a prosecutor turned congresswoman who'd seen how power hides behind paperwork. She didn't bluff. She prepared. By the morning of the hearing, Homan's confidence had curdled into arrogance, the kind that blinds a man to the storm building in front of him. The cameras rolled, the committee convened, and he leaned back in his chair, believing he could outtalk the truth. He couldn't. Because in that room sat the one person who refused to play by his script, the one who'd studied every file, every transaction, every signature. And when she raised her eyes to meet his, he didn't yet realize the story he'd written for himself was about to be rewritten by someone who owed him nothing. The empire of illusion was ready to fall. But before the world watched it crumble, it needed to understand the woman who would strike the first blow. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under the marble ceilings of Congress. It began in the hum of a small Texas courtroom where the fluorescent lights flickered and justice too often felt like a rumor. She had been a public defender then, fighting for clients whose names no one would remember, people chewed up by a system that saw them as case numbers instead of human beings. Those years carved something into her, a quiet ferocity, a belief that truth wasn't something you waited for. It was something you forced into the light. Her mentors used to tell her, "Jasmine, they'll underestimate you, and that's your greatest weapon." She learned early that calm could be sharper than anger, that silence could unsettle men who lived on intimidation. Every time a prosecutor talked over her, she waited. Every time a judge rolled his eyes, she took notes. And when her time came to speak, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. That discipline became her signature. By the time she entered Congress, she had already survived the kind of battles that break most people. The online harassment, the coded insults, the questions about her tone. She'd heard it all. But instead of hardening, she refined her fire into precision. Her words became her weapon, her dignity the armor no opponent could dent. Washington noticed. Some respected her, others feared her, but everyone watched her. There was something magnetic about her presence. The way she could dismantle a talking point with a glance. The way she listened like every word mattered. Even her critics admitted she had a rare kind of grace, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Still, there was a cost to taking on someone like Homan. He wasn't just a man. He was an institution, a symbol worshipped by an entire wing of political media. To accuse him of corruption was to invite a storm. She knew the headlines that would follow. Radical Congresswoman targets American patriot. She could already hear the sound bites, the outrage loops, the threats disguised as commentary. Her team hesitated. "You'll be their next headline," one aide warned. "They'll dig up everything, your past, your family, your speeches." Crockett's response was steady, almost gentle. "Then they'll find what's already public, that I'm not afraid of the truth." That night, she sat alone in her office, city lights flickering outside the window. Her phone buzzed with messages, allies offering support, trolls sending venom. She scrolled once, sighed, and set it down. There was a rhythm to corruption: distract, delay, deny. But not this time. Not when the evidence was this clear. In a voice memo to herself, something she often did before big hearings, she said quietly, "Don't let them change your tone. They win when you break character. Stay calm, stay factual, stay Jasmine." The next morning, she walked through the Capitol's long corridors with the documents tucked under her arm. Reporters called out her name, flashes went off, questions flew. But she didn't stop. Her pace was measured, her posture steady. One journalist shouted, "Congresswoman, are you accusing Tom Homan of taking bribes?" She turned, smiled faintly, and replied, "I'm accusing no one. I'm revealing facts." Behind that line was the force of every late night she'd spent fighting for the voiceless, every insult she'd turned into fuel, every moment she'd chosen composure. By the time she reached the hearing room, the weight of history seemed to hang in the air. Cameras clicked. Staffers shuffled papers nervously. Across the table, Homan was already seated, flanked by aides who looked more confident than they should have. He didn't rise when she entered, a small gesture meant to diminish. She noticed, smiled again, and took her seat. It wasn't the first time a man tried to make her smaller. It would be the last time he succeeded. As the gavel struck, she glanced at the file in front of her, page after page of proof waiting to be spoken aloud. In that moment, she felt the presence of every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or ignored, the ones she used to defend, the ones who never got their day in court. This was for them, too. When the hearing began, her voice would be calm, her tone deliberate, her message unmistakable. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come to survive Washington, she came to change it. And when she finally looked up to meet Homan's gaze, it wasn't anger that filled her eyes. It was inevitability. The storm he had mocked was standing right in front of him, holding the truth like a mirror, and the reflection was about to shatter his illusion. The committee room was packed that morning. Journalists lined the back wall, wires snaking under their chairs. Phones were set to record, cameras focused on the witness table, and a faint hum of chatter filled the air. Tom Homan adjusted his papers, glancing toward the exit as though he owned it. Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, perfectly still, her hands folded over a thin folder of evidence. The chair gavelled in the session. The ritual introductions droned, names, titles, jurisdictions, but everyone knew what they were waiting for. this wasn't going to be another dull oversight hearing. This was a reckoning. Homan started strong, his voice a mix of confidence and condescension. "I've served this country for over 3 decades," he declared, "and I won't sit here while my name is dragged through the mud by political opportunists." His allies nodded on cue, their rehearsed outrage bubbling up in sound bites for later use. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let him finish, her eyes steady on him, like a chess player studying a man who hadn't yet realized he was already in check. When her turn came, she began softly. "Mr. Homan," she said, her tone measured, "you've spoken often about integrity and accountability. I'd like to discuss what those words mean in practice." He smirked. "Congresswoman, I've lived by those words my whole life." She smiled faintly. "Then you won't mind helping me clarify a few details." From the second question, the tension sharpened. She mentioned dates. He grew defensive. She cited invoices. He interrupted. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped, his voice rising. The chair rapped the gavel. "Mr. Homan, please let the Congresswoman finish." Crockett didn't raise her voice. "A witch hunt," she repeated quietly. Interesting choice of words. Because every time someone uses that phrase in Washington, it usually means the fire's getting close. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Homan shifted, his bravado cracking just slightly. He launched into another speech, this time about defending the border and protecting Americans. His tone swelled, full of patriotic fury. It would have worked on cable news, but this wasn't cable news. This was sworn testimony. Crockett waited until he finished. "Protecting Americans," she echoed. "Would that include protecting taxpayers from public officials who profit off government contracts?" The room went still. Homan opened his mouth, but no words came out. A member from his side jumped in, trying to derail her. "Mr. Chairman, this line of questioning is out of order." Crockett didn't even look at him. "What's out of order," she said, calmly, "is pretending corruption is patriotism." The gavel struck again. The chair struggled to restore order. Homan's face reddened. Cameras captured every twitch, every flicker of unease. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispered, "This is getting ugly." But it wasn't ugly. It was revelation in real time. The masks were slipping, the noise thinning out until only truth remained. Crockett leaned forward, lowering her voice until it commanded the silence. "Mr. Homan, I'll ask once more. Do you deny receiving payments from entities that later received federal contracts?" His jaw tightened. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, but the confidence was gone. She nodded, noted. Then almost casually she added, "Because we have the paperwork." The air shifted. The phrase landed like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Even those who had come to defend him knew something had just changed. She didn't elaborate, not yet. Timing was everything. The reveal would come soon, and when it did, there would be no walking it back. The chair called for a brief recess, but the damage was done. Homan avoided her gaze as aides swarmed him, whispering, panicked. Crockett gathered her notes slowly, her face unreadable. She didn't need to celebrate. She just needed to let him sit with the truth he'd spent years denying. Because in Washington, fear doesn't begin when someone raises their voice. It begins when someone stops pretending not to know. And as she stood to leave, one thought lingered in every mind watching her. What exactly was in that folder, and how far was she willing to reveal it? When the hearing reconvened, the room felt different. The noise had drained out, replaced by a collective tightness in the air. The kind that comes when everyone senses something irreversible is about to happen. The aides were tense, the cameras hungry. Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat, the same thin folder still resting before her, its edges marked with yellow tabs and quiet power. The chair gavelled in. The committee will come back to order. Crockett didn't waste a word. Before the recess, she began, her voice even, Mr. Homan made several statements that deserve clarification. I'd like to enter into the record a few documents that speak to those points. Homan's lawyers shifted in their seats. One leaned in close, whispering something urgent, but it was too late. She opened the folder, slowly, methodically. Inside, a series of forms, wire transfers, email chains, memos, each stamped with official letterheads. The camera zoomed in, the microphones picking up the soft rustle of paper like the sound of a curtain rising. Exhibit 12A, a payment from a private security firm, one that 4 months later received a multi-million-dollar federal contract under a program supervised by Mr. Homan's office. He tried to cut in. I don't recall, she continued. Exhibit 12B, internal correspondence showing coordination between that firm and Mr. Homan's personal consultancy. The room froze. The implication was clear. The conspiracy, the quiet machinery of influence, was no longer rumor. It had paperwork. Homan leaned back, eyes darting between his attorneys and the committee. You're taking this out of context. Those payments were for advisory work. Everyone does that. Crockett looked up, and in that moment, her silence said more than any rebuke. She didn't need to argue. She had the receipts, literally. But then she spoke, her tone shifting from prosecutorial precision to something colder, sharper. You're right, Mr. Homan. Everyone does do that, until someone asks them to explain it under oath. Gasps rippled across the audience. On his side of the aisle, allies started deflecting, trying to redirect the conversation to immigration policy, to border chaos, to anything but money and accountability. But Crockett was ready for that too. You keep saying this is about the border, she said, leaning forward slightly. But this isn't about policy. It's about power. Who gets to profit off pain? Who gets to build empires on fear? And who gets away with it because they wear the right badge and say the right slogans? Homan stared at her, the smirk gone, his jaw tight. She laid down the final document. Exhibit 14C, an internal memo referencing a meeting at a private club in D.C. where a former DHS official promised political support in exchange for donations routed through that same firm. The crowd erupted. Shouts, objections, the sound of scrambling order. The chair slammed the gavel. Order! The committee will come to order! Crockett didn't look up. She was still speaking, her voice cutting clean through the chaos. You can call it a witch hunt. You can call it politics. But what you can't call it anymore, she said, is a lie. Silence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Homan's lawyer finally stood, asking for a recess, citing procedural irregularities. But everyone knew the truth. This was the sound of a dam cracking. Crockett closed the folder with a deliberate calm, as though sealing history inside it. I'm not here to destroy anyone's reputation, she said softly. I'm here to remind this country that power without accountability is just corruption wearing a flag. Her words landed like gavel strikes of their own. The camera stayed fixed on her as Homan was escorted out, avoiding eye contact, his once proud stride replaced by the shuffle of a man realizing the headlines had already been written. Somewhere in the press row, a reporter whispered what everyone was thinking. The conspiracy is complete, and she just proved it. And in that moment, as Crockett gathered her papers and the hearing room buzzed with disbelief, the hero of the story didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, resolute. Because exposing corruption isn't about glory. It's about the cost of telling the truth and knowing the bill always comes due. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. The folder might have closed, but the next revelation, the one that would shake even the walls of power, was still waiting in the shadows. By nightfall, the world had already chosen sides. Clips from the hearing dominated every platform. Her calm voice, his trembling defense, the moment that folder snapped shut like a verdict. The algorithm didn't need help. Outrage and admiration did the work on their own. The conspiracy is complete trended within hours, half as an accusation, half as a battle cry. Cable networks replayed it on loop. Commentators leaned in over their studio desks, voices hushed with the gravity of it all. Did Representative Crockett just expose one of the biggest bribery networks inside federal enforcement? One anchor asked. Another answered, she didn't just expose it, she detonated it. But it wasn't just newsrooms, it was living rooms, classrooms, diners, everywhere. On TikTok, young activists stitched her words with captions. Truth doesn't need permission to speak. On X, journalists traded PDFs of exhibits that had already leaked. Scanned, highlighted, dissected. On Reddit, amateur sleuths connected corporate names and shell accounts, mapping a web that seemed endless. And for the first time in months, people weren't arguing about which party was right. They were asking who was honest. In Dallas, a small-town lawyer, once inspired by Crockett's story, streamed the clip to her team before a community rights hearing. That's what courage looks like. Calm, controlled, devastating. Meanwhile, inside D.C., panic took root. Phone lines in congressional offices lit up. Donors demanded explanations, and lawyers whispered about subpoenas. Homan's allies scrambled to distance themselves, issuing carefully worded statements about respecting due process. But the smell of fear lingered. Everyone knew that once a story like this left the hearing room, it was no longer politics. It was legacy. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't post a single word that night. No tweet, no interview, just silence. That silence became louder than any speech. Morning headlines broke like waves. Crockett unveils bribery web inside Homeland operations. Truth doesn't need permission. The line heard around the nation. Is this the beginning of Washington's reckoning? But while media scrambled for the next soundbite, Crockett sat in her office alone, except for a half-drunk coffee and the glow of a muted TV replaying her own face. Her staff watched her carefully. She looked steady, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what she just unleashed. Because every revelation has an echo. The FBI opened a preliminary inquiry within 48 hours. Anonymous officials confirmed credible leads. Congressional allies quietly began drafting an oversight motion. And somewhere in the dark corners of the internet, those who once dismissed her as loud or angry now called her the calm storm that cracked the system. But it wasn't just political machinery shifting. It was hearts. A Latina mother in Arizona recorded a tearful message. When she said truth doesn't need permission, I felt that. We've been told to stay quiet for too long. An immigrant student in New York uploaded a spoken word response titled, "The Folder Opens." his voice trembling with pride. It wasn't about partisanship anymore. It was about representation, about seeing someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and refused to bow to intimidation. Of course, backlash followed too. Talk radio hosts painted her as unpatriotic, radical, performative. Anonymous threats filled her inbox. But the same words that once aimed to silence her only amplified her resolve. Because she'd already learned, dignity under fire isn't weakness, it's strategy. And the more they tried to discredit her, the more her supporters shared the clip again, and again, and again. By the third day, late-night hosts were quoting her. Hashtags evolved. Hashtag Crockett effect. Hashtag truth has no permission. Hashtag the folder opens. Memes, remixes, parodies. But beneath the noise, one truth held steady. People were talking about corruption, about accountability, about how power behaves when it thinks no one's watching. And all because one woman decided silence was no longer the safe choice. Inside the Capitol, whispers grew. Names of others potentially linked, firms under review, contracts about to be audited. It was no longer just her fight. It had become a national reckoning. Yet Jasmine knew something the headlines didn't know. This was only the surface. The folder she opened that day, the one everyone saw, was only one of 3. And as she glanced toward the locked cabinet behind her, the corner of her mouth tightened into a quiet, determined line. Because while America was still processing the first wave of shock, she already knew what was coming next. Something bigger, something darker, something that would shake even the halls that thought themselves untouchable. The conspiracy was complete, yes, but the exposure? That had only just begun. The public frenzy began to settle, but the reverberations hadn't. Washington was buzzing with speculation, and social media still hummed with clips of Crockett's calm dismantling of Hossmann's defenses. But in the quiet of her office, the Congresswoman didn't feel triumph. She felt responsibility. She understood that moments like this weren't about personal victory. They were about shifting the weight of power, reminding the country what integrity looks like when everyone else seems willing to compromise it. She reflected on the hearing, the folder, the stunned faces. She thought about her early days as a public defender, standing in courtrooms where the system favored money and influence over fairness. The people she'd fought for then had no platform, no cameras, no audience. They had only truth, and she realized that was enough to guide her now. Truth had a rhythm of its own. It didn't need shouting, it only needed to be seen and acknowledged. Crockett's approach was deliberate, every word measured, every pause intentional. It wasn't theatrics, it was strategy. Grace, she had learned, was a weapon that could unbalance even the most confident adversary. While Hossmann had relied on bluster and authority, she relied on preparation, clarity, and moral certainty. And the audience, the country watching, responded not to volume, but to virtue manifested through composure. In interviews that followed, she framed the scandal not as a partisan fight, but as a lesson in accountability. Corruption doesn't need a party label, she said. It only needs secrecy. And the moment secrecy meets light, it loses its power. Her words rippled further than any accusation could. They became a mantra, a reminder that standing up for what is right doesn't require you to abandon dignity for drama. She knew the headlines would fade, but the principle wouldn't. Integrity was a seed that, once planted, could inspire others to act, to demand transparency, to challenge the comfortable narratives fed to them by power. Crockett had never sought fame, but in that room, her calm defiance became a symbol. People weren't just watching a hearing, they were watching courage in motion. There was another layer to consider: representation. For women, for immigrants, for people of color, seeing someone like her navigate the corridors of power with composure and effectiveness was transformative. It wasn't enough to fight the system, you had to survive it with your principles intact. And she was proving that survival and influence could coexist without compromise. Late at night, alone in her office, Crockett contemplated what had just happened. The media storm, the social media frenzy, the policy implications, they were all transient. What mattered was embedding a truth into the culture, that authority must answer to ethics, that leadership is measured not by who shouts the loudest, but by who upholds justice when it's inconvenient. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. Strangers who felt empowered, colleagues who respected her restraint, young activists who now believed in the possibility of change. It wasn't applause she sought. It was validation that courage, framed with grace, could ripple further than anger ever could. And in that quiet reflection, she understood something fundamental. Power that relies on intimidation collapses under the weight of composure coupled with proof. Grace wasn't passive, it was active, deliberate, and devastating in its impact. The next chapter, she knew, would demand even more resilience. Hoffman and others wouldn't disappear quietly. The systems that allowed him to operate still existed. But she had proven the principle. Morality paired with strategy could topple empires built on secrecy. As the city slept and the news cycles turned, Jasmine Crockett prepared herself for what was coming. She wasn't just defending the facts, she was modeling a blueprint for action, a guide for anyone who wanted to confront corruption without surrendering their humanity. Because in the end, courage without grace is noise. Grace without courage is ineffectual. But together, they are unstoppable. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile, aware that this was not the end of the story, only the moment when truth took center stage. The dust hadn't yet settled when the lesson became clear. Silence isn't safety. Watching the world react to the hearing, Crockett knew that exposure alone wasn't enough. Accountability required participation, vigilance, and the courage to speak even when the stakes felt impossibly high. She addressed the nation in a brief interview, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The conspiracy is complete, but only if good people remain quiet. Change begins when we refuse to look away, when we refuse to let power hide behind its own authority. Across living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, her words resonated. People who had felt powerless watched a woman dismantle an empire of secrecy without raising her voice in anger. They saw that dignity could outmatch arrogance, that preparation could outmatch bluster, and that truth could outmatch fear. Crockett didn't ask for applause, she asked for action. Not just the action of policymakers or journalists, but the action of ordinary citizens, to question, to verify, to insist that ethics matter, and to hold institutions accountable. Every tweet shared, every conversation started, every post circulated became part of the movement she'd ignited. And as she walked the corridors of Congress one last time that day, the weight of history on her shoulders, she looked toward the future, toward the next fight, the next folder, the next truth, waiting to be revealed. Your voice, she reminded those watching, is the next mic drop. Because courage isn't inherited, it's exercised. And when people choose to act, the story of justice doesn't end. It spreads, unstoppable, echoing in every corner of a country ready to listen. The room fell silent, but the world didn't.